Happy New Year to you, and thank you for joining us again at Voice of Rohingya Radio. We are a registered nonprofit coming to you from the state of Oregon in the United States of America. We'd like to remind you to take a moment and join our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's an easy way to show your support for the program, and it allows us to continue providing the latest news through our exclusive interviews, reports from inside the border, and reputable sources from around the world. Voice of Rohingya Radio is the only news source of its kind in the English-speaking world, bringing you the latest news in a convenient format and keeping you informed and involved. You can listen to our program every week, Sundays at 6 p.m. Pacific Time, by logging on to our Facebook or YouTube page, where we'll keep you up to date with our past and future programs. It is January 11th, 2015. For Voice of Rohingya Radio, I am your host, Zach Taylor. In our top story today, the United Nations Human Rights Envoy for Myanmar asked the authorities in volatile Rakhine State on Friday not to ignore the plight of the minority Rohingya Muslims during a visit to the state dominated by protests by majority Rakhine Buddhists angry over what they consider to be United Nations bias in favor of the persecuted group. Yang Hee Lee visited refugee camps housing the Rohingya who fled deadly communal violence and met with lawmakers and community leaders in Mae Bon Township of Rakhine State's capital, Sitwe. Lee was greeted on arrival in Rakhine on Thursday by hundreds of chanting and placard-waving protesters. On Friday, during her visit to the refugee camps, she also faced protesting Buddhist monks and others with posters calling for the UN to be impartial and saying that they could not accept the term Rohingya. At Sitwe Airport, as many as 500 Arakanese nationalists were waiting to protest her arrival on Thursday. They say they are angered by Lee's report urging the Burmese government to embrace the term Rohingya and grant citizenship to Arakan's persecuted Muslim community. We saw her report as inconsiderate towards our national security and interfering with the country's sovereignty more than necessary, said Ko Thween, one of the protesters. We are protesting to show that we absolutely do not accept it. Officials and the people in predominantly Buddhist Myanmar refer to Rohingyas as Bengalis because they believe them to be illegal immigrants from neighboring Bangladesh, even though they have lived in Myanmar for decades. The UN contends that officials in Rakhine State violate the rights of the minority group, which numbers about 1 million. Aung Win, a lawmaker from the state's dominant Rakhine National Party, told RFA's Myanmar service that Lee said that refugees who have lost their human rights shouldn't be ignored and wants local Rakhine ethnics to live together with Muslims peacefully and let them work freely by forgiving them with patience. Local residents told Lee that it would take some time before the Muslim Rohingya and ethnic Rakhine could live together harmoniously. They also told her it would be impossible for the two groups to live together as long as the Muslim community requested that the Rakhine people recognize them as Rohingya, a name rejected by the local population. Lee's agenda includes meetings with the Chief Minister of Rakhine State to discuss peace and rule of law developments, including the Rakhine Action Plan and community leaders about intercommunal tensions and efforts towards reconciliation, according to a statement issued by the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, Switzerland. The government's Rakhine State Action Plan to develop the state requires Rohingya to meet stringent verification requirements for citizenship. Under the policy, Rohingya must supply proof of a 6-decade residency to qualify for naturalized citizenship, a second-class citizenship with fewer rights than full citizenship that would classify them as Bengali rather than Rohingya. Those who fail to meet the requirements or refuse the Bengali classification would be housed in camps and then deported. Lee's 10-day visit to Myanmar comes on the heels of a UN resolution passed late last month calling on Myanmar to grant full citizenship to the minority group, allowing them to move about freely and give them equal access to services. Guy Horton, a British academic who was shortlisted last year for the special rapporteur job, exhorted Lee to take bold action on the Rohingya issue, writing that she's the only person who can speak out, condemn, and prevent the destruction of the Rohingya. He also recommended that Lee pursue a program to educate all political parties on the meaning and applicability of federalism, demand access to Kachin IDPs, and request the formation of a truth commission. During her visit to Myanmar, Lee will also assess the progress that authorities have made with their commitments to democratic reform and review issues related to freedom of association of the media, land disputes, and protests against developmental projects. She will travel to the northern Shan states, the site of clashes between government troops and armed ethnic rebels, to examine the human rights situation of religious and ethnic minorities, and will also speak with various parties about the situation of sexual and gender-based violence in the context of the ongoing conflict in the region. During Lee's visit to Rohingya residents in a displacement camp near Myanmar, Zaza, a Muslim in the camp, said the residents told her of their hardships and unfulfilled promises on the part of the government. There are people in the camp who were awarded citizenship after accepting the term Bengali, and who did this because the government promised to allow them to travel freely, Zaza said. But to date, we still cannot travel freely anywhere and continue to be confined in this 30-acre camp. Lee also will look at the human rights concerns raised by Myanmar's proposed bills on the protection of race and religion because they contain provisions that are not in accordance with international human rights standards. I am deeply concerned that if passed, these 4 bills will legitimize discrimination, in particular against religious and ethnic minorities and against women, Lee said. Lee first visited Myanmar to assess its human rights situation last July. She will submit a report on her current trip to the United Nations in April. In related news, top State Department human rights envoy Tom Malinowski began his trip to Myanmar today, coinciding with UN Special Rapporteur on Myanmar Yang Hee Lee's 10-day visit. The government's failure to prevent Buddhist-Muslim clashes and continued discrimination against the stateless Rohingya are at the top of a long list of enduring human rights concerns. During 2 days of talks in Nay Pyi Taw, the capital, starting Wednesday, U.S. officials will also discuss with Myanmar officials reforms needed to its outdated legal system, the growing problem of land grabs, and recent detentions of peaceful demonstrators and journalists. The Obama administration views its diplomatic opening to Myanmar, which began in 2012, as a major foreign policy achievement and says problems on the path to democracy were to be expected. During a visit last November, President Barack Obama acknowledged backsliding in reforms, but underscored Washington's continued support. U.S. lawmakers and rights activists, however, have become increasingly critical of both President Thein Sein's government and the U.S. approach. Until the U.S. government stops wagging their finger at the Burmese government's human rights record with one hand while using the other hand to give them economic handouts, the Burmese government can and will continue to ignore complaints about their human rights record, said Jennifer Quigley, president of the U.S. Campaign for Burma. Changes to a junta-era constitution before elections in late 2015 appear increasingly slim, meaning opposition leader Aung San Suu Kyi, whom Malinowski is scheduled to meet, will be unable to contest for the presidency. The Constitution also guarantees the military 25% of parliamentary seats. Malinowski will meet with civil society activists in the main city of Yangon before the talks in Nay Pyi Taw, which will be the second such human rights dialogue since the normalization of diplomatic relations. Lieutenant General Anthony Crutchfield, Deputy Commander of the U.S. Pacific Command, will join the dialogue, meeting senior representatives of the Myanmar military to discuss military conduct and reform. You are listening to Voice of Rohingya Radio. Thanks again for tuning in to Voice of Rohingya Radio, a registered non-profit from the state of Oregon in the United States of America, bringing you English-language news concerning the Rohingya and other persecuted minorities in Myanmar. I am your host, Zach Taylor. Myanmar's first Catholic cardinal, Charles Maung Bo, said on Tuesday that religious extremism could derail Myanmar's much-vaunted reform process. Bo, who was named a cardinal by Pope Francis on the 4th of January, warned that Buddhist nationalism directed against minority Muslims could drive the latter to connect with international extremist groups that would retaliate. Bo told Reuters in an interview at the Red Brick Cathedral in downtown Yangon that so far the country's Muslim population have been more on the quiet side. But if they come with the force of an international community of Muslims, then violence, terrorism, suicide bombers, and all these things could happen. Boo called for mutual understanding and urged the government to do more to curb the hate speech by radical monks. Boo said he was optimistic about Myanmar's reform process, but warned that the military could again seize control if the peace process failed and sectarian violence continued. "We hope that chaos won't happen," he said, calling on the military to make greater efforts to build trust with ethnic armed groups and for more monks to speak out against extremism. "For peace in the country, the Buddhist monks also have quite a major role to play too," he said. Pope Francis appointed 20 new cardinals, 15 of whom will be eligible to vote for the next pope. It was the first time cardinals from Myanmar, Tonga, and Cape Verde were appointed, and the appointees from all three nations are electors. Bangladesh yesterday urged the international community to come up with a louder voice to resolve the long-pending Rohingya refugee issue and ensure their return to their homeland. The Foreign Ministry held a meeting with stakeholders at the ministry with the Foreign Secretary in the chair where the current situation of the issue was discussed. "We discussed the overall situation and want to see the international community come up with a louder voice," an official who attended the meeting told the news agency. He said the root of the problem lies on the Myanmar side and that they laid emphasis on the solution. Responding to a question, the operation of some unregistered NGOs was also discussed. Now some 30 to 32,000 documented Myanmar nationals are living in Bangladesh. We now turn to our sources from inside the border who are saying that a 9-year-old girl has been raped by multiple military personnel as she took her cattle to graze near the hills. Local sources say that the military men belong to Battalion 565. The incident happened near Maungda on Tuesday and was reportedly hushed up, with military personnel going to the victim's house and threatening them with dire consequences if they spoke to the media or international NGOs. A 2014 report by a Myanmar-based human rights organization, the Women's League of Burma, said that it had documented more than 100 cases of rape by the military, some involving girls as young as 8. The NGO says that the military continues to use rape as a weapon of war against ethnic minorities, even after the reformist government of Thein Sein was welcomed by the international community for bringing about positive change in the once isolated nation. Alongside Muslim girls of Arakan, minors in Kachin and Shan states have been subjected to rape by the military in recent times. According to the rights organization, sexual violence of minors is being used as a tool to demoralize and destroy ethnic communities. In other news, one of our sources, who wished to remain anonymous due to fear of government retaliation, recently detailed many of the socio-political and humanitarian struggles Rohingya are facing in the country. Our source says the recent Myanmar Election Commission decision on disqualifying all except those who hold national scrutiny cards from being a member of political parties or engaging in political activity is a curse on the entire Rohingya community, saying that it's also an attempt to prevent Muslims of Arakan from participating in the next general election to be held in late 2015. Our source cited widespread harassment, looting, money extortion, arbitrary arrests, unjust jail sentences, and torture as daily occurrences. Indiscriminate arrests are being made by the border guard police on trumped-up charges of links with armed groups leading to jail terms and exorbitant payoffs to officials to avoid them. The source says the BGP, police, and army are bent on squeezing as much money as possible by using various means, such as planting Bangladeshi mobile phone SIM cards on targeted Rohingya to arrest them for illegal SIM possession. He also explained that the Rohingya students are grossly deprived of education, with basic primary education being totally abandoned by the government and no government-appointed teachers attending the schools throughout the Rohingya majority areas. Our source added that since 2012, Maungda district, along with some other townships, are still under a seemingly unending curfew, drastically reducing Islamic religious activities, with mosque activities being heavily restricted and religious schools being shut down for more than 2 years. Our source pleaded to the government of Myanmar to, among other things, abide by the UNGA regulations, take steps to repeal all anti-Rohingya laws passed in the parliament, repeal the recent decrees by EC directed against Rohingya, to give protection to Rohingya students pursuing higher education, and to take measures to ensure security of the lives of the Rohingya. Thanks again for listening to Voice of Rohingya Radio, a weekly news program bringing you up-to-date information about the Rohingya people in Myanmar. You can catch our broadcasts every Sunday at 6 p.m. Pacific Time here in the United States at youtube.com/VOR Radio, or you can join our page on Facebook to find more information on the program. For Voice of Rohingya Radio, this is Zach Taylor, signing out.